Happy Saturday. It's March 1st, 2025, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And we are two of your Airmail editors who are here to bring you into an alternative version of reality full of culture, books, and more beautiful things. On that note, Michael, first, it was somewhat of a week in the news. Once again, the Trump administration is standing up for the bad guys. This week's news concerns the social media influencer Andrew Tate. He was arrested in Romania in 2022 and is facing charges of rape, human trafficking, money laundering, and forming an organized crime group to sexually exploit women, among other things. He flew on a private jet to Florida this week after lobbying for his release by the Trump administration. Tate's platform primarily speaks to young men and encourages them to espouse the values of conservatism and male superiority, in addition to rejecting feminism. Thank you, Trump. Meanwhile, the DOJ is giving the people, or at least some of them, what they want. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced that the department will release classified documents relating to Jeffrey Epstein, including, quote, lots of names and flight logs for the private jet known as the Lolita Express. Meanwhile, in New York, our embattled Mayor Eric Adams is back on the scene, hitting up some of the city's ever-expanding number of private clubs for dinner. If that is not enough reason to stay home and read Airmail, well, we don't really know what is. On that note, Michael, let's get to it.
Of course. First, the president has made a big show lately about torpedoing DEI initiatives. But as our co-editor Alessandra Stanley notes in her column this week, he's replaced it with his own special brand of affirmative action. Something you might call LOO, which is all about loyalty, obsequiousness, and obedience. She'll explain it all. Then, since it's Oscar weekend, we have two great writers who know about movies to joining us to talk about them. First, everyone knows Annie Hall is one of the great movies of the past 50 years, Ashley, you included. But Alex Belth has a story of how Woody Allen's 1977 love story starring Diane Keaton, which he originally conceived of as a stream of consciousness film, was considered a total flop when he finished it. And Alex is going to reveal how Allen then reconceived the movie in the editing room and transformed it into the movie we know and love, one that also went on to win the Oscar for Best Picture in 1978. Then, Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg were among the most consequential figures in the whole history of show business as the founders of MGM Studio. And Sam Wasson is going to join us from Los Angeles to discuss their role in creating movies as we know them and maybe what they think about the landscape today. So, Ashley, where would you like to begin?
Well, Michael, let's bring on Alessandra Stanley. Not only is she the co-editor of Airmail, but she was the New York Times bureau chief in Moscow and in Rome. She knows a thing or two about international relations, and she can help make sense of Trump if anyone can. Welcome, Alessandra.
Hello.
Okay, so Alessandra, is it true that some of Trump's sycophants are starting to turn on him already?
Well, not exactly. There are some people who are Trump supporters who are appalled by the idea of putting up buildings in Gaza because they thought he meant it when he said he would never send troops over. That's a different category. The category that interests me most are sort of the neocons who were so obsessed with DEI and cancel culture and all those things. They so demonized woke culture that they sort of, even those that didn't vote for Trump, made it easier for people who were on the fence because they were basically saying, counter law is so horrible, you might as well just go ahead and vote for Trump. And I think that was a huge mistake. I think some of them are beginning to realize it. But the degree of exhilaration that they had when Trump came to power because it was the death knell for woke culture was, in retrospect, really stupid.
Well, in your view from here this week, you posit that Trump has gotten rid of DEI, but he's replaced it in a certain way with a different form of favoritism. You're calling it, I believe, LOO. Do we pronounce this Lou?
Yes, it's Lou. It's loyalty and obsequiousness and obedience. And every person he has nominated to any position fits into those categories. So the idea that somehow, and again, these are the neocons who kind of wanted to believe that if you got rid of Democrats, you'd get rid of woke culture and merit would somehow be a criterion are just flat on their backs right now. Shall we name names?
Yeah, why don't we name some names?
The one that I find the most appalling is Neil Ferguson, because he's this esteemed academic, very pro-Trump, very anti-woke. He created a whole university called University of Austin that just teaches, I think, probably the classics in Neil Ferguson. And he was just crowing when Trump won. Then when Trump suddenly did what we knew Trump was going to do, which was trash Zelensky and basically abandon Ukraine to cozy up to Putin, he wrote a column sort of saying, I'm really shocked to find that there's appeasement. This is a guy who makes his living, besides being an academic, he consults on geopolitics as a consultant. And the idea that he couldn't see where Trump was headed in foreign policy was just appalling.
Now, Alessandra, you worked as a journalist in Russia. And the leaders there obviously have a great tradition of prioritizing and rewarding loyalty. Do you think Trump is as bad or worse as they are?
Well, you never want to call anyone a Stalinist until they actually kill 100 million people. But certainly you can see that the seeds of Stalinism are, let's just call him an authoritarian. But Stalin famously had a scientist, Lysenko, who didn't believe in genetics. And he convinced Stalin that genetics was a bourgeois fake science. And so geneticists throughout the Soviet Union were put in jail or even killed. And during the famines, of course, they couldn't grow crops because Lysenkoism, didn't work. So then you think of RFK and you think of all the other people that he's appointed and the climate denialism and everything else. And you think, as authoritarians go, he's also not a smart one.
The last time we spoke with you on the podcast, this was before the election, you said that you believed, I believe I quote, that America could withstand another Trump term. Do you care to change your position on that at this juncture?
Oh, I think we'll withstand it because I'm optimistic. I'm not optimistic about foreign policy, but I'm optimistic that he will fail and will not get away with everything he's trying to do, that he'll get stopped. Not so much by some courts, but also by the economy and his own mistakes. But yeah, we'll survive. I don't know if it'll be worth it. But yes, I think like a lot of people, I did not think it would be this bad, this fast. The appointments he's made, I just didn't think they could be that consistently ludicrous.
It feels like we're reading The Onion or an old issue of Spy Magazine. It's like Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth. I mean, it's almost like a joke. Another country that you bring up in your column, terrifyingly, is Venezuela. Do you care to make that comparison?
Well, it's just that if you get rid of all the experts, if you're a country like Venezuela that has lots of, oil and natural resources, but then you get rid of anybody who's an expert who doesn't pledge loyalty above all, then you're kind of stuck because then there's no way of extracting that oil. There's no way of extracting those minerals. You're stuck with a bunch of people who are incompetent. So yeah, Venezuela does come to mind.
I mean, reading your column this week, it's like, I thought, well, Lincoln had his team of rivals and Trump has his kind of like clown car of lick spittles. It just is like, who can line up fastest to lick the boots on it? It's astounding.
Well, it was that way in the first term.
But even more now.
There were some people that he didn't choose that were there to sort of, as they say, be guardrails. And this time he has only chosen the clown car. There's no adults. And of course you have Elon Musk.
Given how vindictive Trump is and how punitive he seems to be, especially towards journalists, like how do you feel editing a magazine like Airmail with Graydon at this particular moment? I mean, it's kind of a meta question, but like, is this really a moment for journalists like us to step up and do the hardcore reporting on what's going on with Trump? I mean, are we afraid of how he might retaliate? What's your view on all of that?
Well, I think we're too small to fail. We're a small organization. I can't imagine that anything we write, I mean, I'm sure he could be irritated by it, but I think he's going to go for the big, as he has, ABC, AP, or whatever, things that are on his radar. I'm not sure he knows Airmail exists, or he may just think it's still the way the post office works. So I'm not that worried, but, famous last words. Luckily, we don't have that kind of income. So if he goes after our taxes.
Bring on the audit. Yeah, but it's just interesting. I mean, can you recall a period in American history and in journalism where journalists have been so imperiled in our own country?
Possibly, but I couldn't think of one. I mean, I'm sure that there were times, there was a lot of censorship during the wars, Civil War, World War I, World War II, but nothing like this, obviously. Because it's the pettiness is what's so captivating. It's not that the AP did some big expose on corruption within his family. They just said, we're not going to call it the Gulf of America. We're going to call it what it is called, the Gulf of Mexico. And that was enough to set him off. I mean, that's what's so extraordinary about him. It makes him so special. But unfortunately, everybody hates the press. I mean, they're going to start to love us soon enough because they'll need us. But right now, it's kind of like we're like federal workers. Nobody really cares. Everybody's happy to see Trump stomp on the press and on federal workers. But that'll change, I think.
Stay tuned. Alessandra, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's move on to the world of cinema because we need some good old-fashioned escapism from the times we live in.
We sure do. And, where do you want to go? Do you want to go to one of your favorite films ever right now, or to a little further back than that? What's your choice?
Michael, there's no discussion. It's not one of my favorite films. It is my favorite film. Annie Hall, unfortunately, was way too influential on me as a young woman. I made some very poor romantic decisions based on ideas that were presented there, but we can talk about that in another episode because we have Alex Belk here to tell us all about how Woody Allen's classic comedy, romance, everything we love in life became that film. Alex is the editor of Esquire Classic and the curator of the Stax Reader. He's worked in film editing for the likes of Ken Burns, the Coen brothers, and yes, Woody Allen. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So, Alex, I believe it is in our bathroom at the Airmail office on 9th Street that we have a little sign that says, editing is the art of elimination. And nowhere is that more true than in the film Annie Hall, it turns out. Who knew?
Yeah, that was a point where Woody Allen had sort of reached a crossroads in his career. And Annie Hall really marks the demarcation between his earlier, funnier movies and then his later, more mature and serious movies. But initially, the movie was written as a kind of 40-year-old guy looking back at his life, commenting on contemporary culture. And when Woody Allen and Marshall Brickman, who co-wrote the script with him, screened the first cut, they thought, whoa, this is not working at all. What was working was the love story with Diane Keaton. And so because Woody Allen always budgeted reshoots into his films, he always allowed for a certain looseness of, okay, we don't have the total story yet. But this was a case probably, Take the Money and Run, his first big movie, had probably more editing in it. But this was, I think, a case in which the radical change that was found in the editing room led to the serendipity of probably his best movie.
So originally, the first cut was well over 2 hours long, right? Like, how much of the film did they end up taking out in order to get to the meat of this love story?
Well, I think there was probably a decent amount of it. I don't know, I literally don't know what the footage would be or how much of the movie would be. But there was there's a whole sequence where Woody Allen and his first wife his second wife or he's watching a basketball game at a cocktail party. Well, that ended up into a big scene where Woody was playing with philosophers against the New York Knicks. So, that was a big sequence that was lost. There was a sequence, a sci-fi spoof of 1950 science fiction movies called The Invasion of the Element, in which an African-American family moved into Woody Allen's Jewish neighborhood as a kid. That was lost. And so there were loads of sequences that, if you talk to Sandy Morris, who was the apprentice film editor on it, were actually quite funny, but they just didn't fit into the movie, and so they just had to be lost.
Annie Hall went on to be, one of the greatest comedic love stories ever portrayed in cinema. But, what did this film mean for Diane Keaton, really? Because this ended up being her big moment, right?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it was her coming out. Clearly she had been around. She had been in 3 Woody movies before that. She had been in the original cast of Hair, before that, and she was a singer. But this was a movie where Woody really let parts of Diane Keaton's personality come into the movie. The fact that she was a singer, the fact that she took photographs. Those were things right out of Keaton's life. And I think probably the most memorable thing that came out of Keaton's life was her wardrobe. That is just probably one of the, in terms of fashion, right, Michael? Isn't that probably one of the most legendary performances? The costume designer, she was horrified. And Woody said, no, let her wear what she wants to wear. And so I think he just led with that. But he knew the chemistry with Keaton was what was the most winning material that they had. And actually, just to follow up, I realized I didn't even answer your question. For Keaton, it was her coming out. She won Best Actress, and this really launched her career as being, and this was a more substantial, even though it was a comedic role, it was a lot more substantial than the comedic role she had played in Sleeper or in Love and Death. And so there was real substance to that part.
One of the things I love about Annie Hall is I've seen it probably 30 times, 40. And I get something different out of it each time. There are so many funny moments. In some ways, it's sort of like a montage, right? How much do we know about what Woody Allen and Marshall Brickman were originally envisioning with this film?
We know quite a bit. I mean, we know quite a bit. And again, a lot of it was a guy at 40 years old really examining his life in the context of where he came from, his childhood, examining his relationships, examining the state of the world. So I think that was really their initial impulse. And what they found was the most interesting material that they had was this love story or a story about relationships. And so that really became the connective glue. And when they went to do reshoots, most of the reshoots were small scenes that provided expository information. Like, for instance, the scene that got the biggest laugh in the entire movie is when Woody sneezes on the cocaine. But that was a scene that was completely written just to get Annie and Alvy to Los Angeles. The scene in which Annie comes back from her first trip to the psychiatrist and they get into a discussion about Sinatra's glasses, and Alan turns to the camera and he breaks the fourth wall and he says, I'm not crazy. She said wife, not life. I'm not crazy. You were there. That was a reshoot. And that's the kind of thing where it's a fourth wall breaking thing, which you think could take you totally out of the story. But in Annie Hall, I think one of the remarkable things about the final product, considering that they were really throwing a lot against the wall, is that it all does feel like it fits.
Well, I mean, part of that's got to be too also because the incredible chemistry between Alan and Keaton, right? I mean, they had been in a relationship at one point. They were not together when this movie was filmed, but clearly there's an element of something there that gives them this indelible chemistry that I think few other couples in film have managed to approximate.
It's a Nick and Nora thing. I mean, you can't really replicate that. The first scene that they shot was the scene when they're vacationing in East Hampton with trying to put the lobsters in the thing. And they did that straight. And there was one take that they did where they were goofing around. And that's the take they kept. Because to your point, that evoked that sort of chemistry that they had. That's the reason they care about that movie, is because we all understand the ups and downs of relationships. And that movie is both kind of realistic in the fact that, hey, relationships don't always work. But you can also leave a relationship with a kind of, not wistfulness, but a warmth towards that person that you got to spend time with.
I loved in your piece how you revealed some of the alternative titles to Annie Hall. Remind us what they were.
Me and My Goy, I think, was Marshall Brickman's best one. I mean, the most famous one was Anahondia. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's essentially a technical term that means the inability to enjoy oneself, which actually is probably the most fitting joke for Woody in general, but particularly that movie, because, the opening joke is, the two old ladies at the resort and says, oh, the food here is so terrible. And the other one says, yeah, it's such small portions. For a long time, it was like most Woody Allen movies, it was just called Untitled.
Alex, one of the things I love about your reporting is, it takes us inside, and you've got that scene where, and I'm reminded of Alan's past. He started off as a writer for Sid Caesar, and there's scenes where they're in the editing room with other people, and they just had the confidence, number one, to throw stuff out, to rewrite the scenes, and number two, just to sit there in silence and trying to solve it. And I think that's, a testament to sort of like his focus on it, right?
Yeah, I think that he seemed to be a problem-solving guy in which he would always have ideas, but he was never particularly wed to one of them. And I think that makes somebody successful because they can keep moving, but particularly back then, remember, guys, the physical task of editing took longer. So that even if you were to screen an 8-minute reel on your flatbed and you got to the end of it and then you needed to rewind it, it's going to take 3.5 or 4 minutes. And as that's rewinding, you're naturally pondering things. You're thinking about things. Yes, of course, you can think of Martin Scorsese, coke-fueled, like Raging Bull, like editing rooms, like that kind of frenetic pace. But I think that there's also a lot to be said for what Brickman said about Alan's ability to be quiet and to let the problems sort of naturally resolve themselves, because everyone there was smart and they were really intelligent.
Yeah, and also I think, as many people don't even realize this, but, 1978, the Oscars, Alan becomes the first man to be nominated for Best Actor, Best Original Screenplay, Best Director, and Best Picture. Only guy before that who'd had that was Orson Welles for Citizen Kane. And it's the first, one of the few comedies to win for Best Picture, right?
It is. The other thing that I wanted to note really quickly is that the contributions of Gordon Willis, the cinematographer, cannot be minimized on that movie.
Well, Alex, it's a terrific story and a great reminder of how hard it is to make an unforgettable movie, as well as how inspired the process can be as well. So thanks again for being here.
Well, la-di-da, Michael, that put me in a very happy headspace.
Well, la-di-da.
I mean, it's so funny. We also have an article in the issue this week about the resurgence of women in ties. Like, it's a very Annie Hall moment yet again, 40 years after the fact. 50? Dear God, no, almost.
It's not just ties that are back, but I would also then it's like the fuller cut pant. Even the silhouette that Annie wore is a little bit back now.
I mean, I try to replicate her style on the tennis court, Michael. It's a very minimal success. She never failed. There's so many great scenes from that movie, so many great lines. Oh God, I'm going to watch it again tonight, probably. I need it. But we're not quite done with Hollywood, Michael. We rely on it more than ever in times like these. And we are going to bring on our man in Hollywood, or one of our men in Hollywood, Sam Wasson, to tell us about two characters who have not exactly been lost to history, but who are getting a new analysis in a biography by Kenneth Turan called Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg, The Whole Equation. Sam is a writer at large at Airmail and the author of several books about Hollywood, including my favorite, The Path to Paradise, a Francis Ford Coppola story. Welcome, Sam.
Hi.
In the issue of Airmail this week, you review a new joint biography by Kenneth Turan that covers two characters whom you describe as some of the most influential people to ever exist in Hollywood, Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. Who were they?
Well, Louis B. Mayer was one of the founders of MGM, which you could say is the greatest studio of its day, the greatest studio of all time. And in a popular imagination, he set the mold for what we think of as the studio head, for better or for worse. I happen to think for better. Thalberg, by contrast, was his head of production. And I really do mean by contrast. He's characterized in history and by those who knew him as the opposite of Louis B. Mayer. I mean, refined where Mayer is coarse, intellectual where Mayer is a Philistine. At least that's how the legend is. And I'm very much interested as someone who tells Hollywood history how these ideas, not just what's true and what's not true, but how this misinformation gets out there, that certain people are so-called geniuses when in fact they weren't, or why certain people were bad when in fact they were good. And the Mayer-Thalberg story is a nice way to get into those ideas.
Well, we know that these two gentlemen were professionally intertwined, but how close was their relationship personally?
Thalberg was thought of as like a son to Mayer, the son he never had. These guys who founded the movie business were really into dynasty. That was something that was absolutely on their mind. One of the reasons I love them. They took such pride in what they were doing because they felt the world was antagonistic to them. They kept it a family business to the best of their ability. Selznick married Louis Mayer's daughter. So LB was Selznick's father-in-law, that kind of stuff. But yes, Thalberg was like a son to Mayer.
And what was their first big hit professionally?
I don't know what the first big hit professionally was, but I think Grand Hotel would characterize the Thalberg MGM sensibility. A lot of money on the screen and a fancy literary property. It won Best Picture, and people took it at the time to be real high filmmaking, really sophisticated filmmaking, in part because it was set in a sophisticated setting and based on a novel. People thought it really transcended what was coarse about movies, but it doesn't, in fact, and nobody watches Grand Hotel anymore, and yet we still regard Thalberg as the genius of MGM. So I think those two ideas are incompatible. And I'm really interested in asking the question, why do people regard Thalberg as the secret weapon of MGM when it was, to my mind, so clearly Louis B. Mayer?
Well, I love that you kind of have an answer to that question in your column this week, because Thalberg, who, as you note, also died young, 37, had perhaps the greatest publicist ever in Hollywood.
That helps. Yeah, no, if you can get Fitzgerald to write a book about you, a novel about you, and then die before he completes it, you're in good shape for the rest of your life, even if you're dead, which Thalberg was. The mystique of The Last Tycoon has really helped the Thalberg image and reputation. But of course, Fitzgerald didn't know the first thing about movie making. I mean, Fitzgerald's screenplays, I mean, if anyone tells you that Hollywood killed Fitzgerald, run from this person, because Fitzgerald was a fabulous novelist, but could not write a movie to save his life. And like most screenwriters, blamed the system instead of himself. So the fact that Fitzgerald picks Thalberg to lionize tells you something right there of his misinformed ideas about what a real producer is. And again, that gets to the wrong ideas people have about Thalberg. You know, Thalberg was interested in making the movies high art, and so really courted writers. And it was at the beginning of sound. So writers were the new fetish in Hollywood. It was thought that dialogue is what was going to make movies as fancy as the theater. And Thalberg became the image of that. But of course, it's really not what makes a great movie. It's what makes a great script. But great movies have cinematic values. And Thalberg's movies, for the most part, didn't. So it all ties into that Fitzgerald romance of the man who loved literature making movies.
And Mayer then, obviously, as you know, they sort of had left brain, right brain, Thalberg for writers. Mayer was about talent and spectacle and working, and which was that other great part of what studios in Hollywood sort of built itself on, right?
Right. MGM, as their logo said, more stars than there are in heaven. That was Mayer's doing. Mayer was really the nurturer and opposition. He was both good cop and bad cop to the talent, to the actors and directors and writers, and was himself more inclined to actors. He was an emotional, hot-headed Jew, and Thalberg was a more assimilated Jew. And that's another part of this story that needs to be looked at, that Mayer took on in this diptych all of the negative qualities of the Jew, the stereotypical anti-Semitic qualities, and Thalberg was like the Gentile Jew, and so therefore like the elegant one. But yeah, what we think of as MGM, all of those stars, that's a Mayer phenomenon. And all of those musicals are all post-Thalberg. I mean, he was unquestionably good at his job and a great politician. I don't mean to denigrate him, just to get him into perspective.
Sam, I'm fascinated by this discussion today because this book about these titans of Hollywood, lands at a moment when Hollywood is celebrating its centenary, 100th anniversary of many of these studios coming along and these guys who built this town. But this town is also in this strange existential moment right now. And MGM finds itself curiously in the news this last week with, this great library studio now owned by a man named Jeff Bezos, right? Who is, putting his own imprint on it, specifically with James Bond this past week. I'm just curious, how you see the landscape now and what we would make of it all if these guys were around.
Well, I just wish we could call this celebration a funeral. I think it's really important to say it's over, because to say that it's still alive is to enable it. It's a cultural calamity. These people are making, at best, television. I could go on. And we've seen enough streaming, enough tech people, in positions of power by now to know that they don't know what they're doing. It's as dark a period as it's ever been for the movies, and I believe will only get darker. I'd rather just call it a day, say it was over, and not have to pretend anymore that what we're looking at is of value. I'm fun.
Yeah, as you say, MGM is now owned by Jeff Bezos and putting his stamp on it. And so it's great to have the context of these guys, but the landscape is very different.
It's very poignant because we love movies so much. Everybody loves movies. That to say it's over would be so sad, and it would keep us from doing something that's so natural, which is what movies have you seen? What movies are playing? And to take off the delusional glasses and face the fact that we're not getting fed, I don't think we can handle it. With everything else that's going on in the world that's life-threatening, maybe we truly can't take this on right now. Maybe a cultural disaster isn't as scary as everything else. But as far as our spiritual well-being goes, it's as scary as it gets. To me.
Well, thanks, Sam. On that cheery note, what are you excited about as we go into the Academy Awards on Sunday? Just give us one movie you've loved, something that gets you excited.
A movie I liked that didn't get distribution at all was Clint Eastwood's movie, Juror Number 2. Warner's dropped it. It's not great, but it's got a story. it doesn't have excess in it, and it's capable. In this era of 4-hour movies, that was a relief. I liked the kids in Anora. I thought they were great.
Don't forget Clint Eastwood came up through the Warner Brothers system.
I know, isn't that's so sad?
When you say there's not excess in it, I mean, it's those great lean, it was almost like the quote unquote, he learned that style and it was like, lean and it entertains, makes you think. 100 minutes, you're out, done.
Exactly. I mean, Brief Encounter makes me cry in 5 minutes. I mean, I remember when I saw Bradley Cooper's A Star is Born, I was crying right away. When you see people on screen having a connection, you're in a movie. And that doesn't take 4 hours with an intermission and chapter titles and all of this bullshit. It just takes people telling the truth to each other. It's really that simple. And we don't get that. We don't get that. We got that in Anora. What did you see, Ashley?
Well, I saw The Brutalist.
Okay. I didn't see it.
Okay. Yeah, it was beautifully shot and Brody's an incredible actor, so that was fun. Actually, I will say, I think, A Star is Born, for my money, is by far 20 times better than The Brutalist.
Yeah. Bradley Cooper is, to me, one of the most exciting directors in Hollywood. I wish he was taken seriously. I guess because he's a good-looking actor, people think he's not really a director. But Star is Born was so good, and Maestro was such a healthy effort. I put my chips on him. I mean, I would get excited. For the third movie, I would feel that tingle that I used to feel of, I'm going to see something. I'm going to see something good. I'm going to see something with heart, human beings, and passion. That's probably 110 minutes long.
Great soundtrack too. Sam Wasson, the one and only. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you again soon.
You guys are so fun. Thank you.
The award goes to Sam.
Thank you.
Totally.
Thanks for getting up early, Sam.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Okay, Michael. Now, I know you and I are not as nihilistic as Sam. We have something that we can recommend.
I do. And I'll just say, this is Oscar weekend, of course. But we also lost one of the greats this week, Gene Hackman. So I thought, why not take it as a chance to watch whichever film it is you love, or maybe one you've never seen. Anything from French Connection to Hoosiers, Unforgiven to The Conversation, Bonnie and Clyde to one of your favorites, I know, Ashley, Royal Tenenbaums. So many wonderful films, lots to choose from. And you, my dear, what do you have?
Michael, I do have something I can recommend. And before I even go into this, I'm just going to apologize to Harrison, our communications director at Airmail. He told me I was not supposed to talk about this and share it with anyone. And yet here we are talking about it on the podcast. I will not reveal a single detail. All I will say is it's called When the Going Was Good. It is by Graydon Carter. It is coming out on March 27th in the UK, 28th in the US, and it's the best thing I've read all year. And I tore through this thing, Michael. I slept for 4 hours and 28 minutes last night per my Oura Ring because I couldn't put the damn thing down. I think it's incredible and so fun, and I can't wait to have Graydon on to talk about it in a few weeks. So on that note, will you please read us out?
The Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan, and our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting, but in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music, but most of all, thank you again for joining us.